The emergency room was alive with the sounds of controlled chaos. The steady beeping of monitors, the quick shuffle of nurses' footsteps, and the urgent murmur of doctors' voices blended together, creating an atmosphere of life and death decisions. Every second counted. At the center of this storm stood Dr. Elijah Matthews, a calm figure amid the whirlwind. His eyes moved across the room with precision, quickly assessing the situation. He'd seen it all before, but every case was as important as the last. Today was no different. A nurse approached him, her expression tight, a mixture of worry and urgency. "Dr. Matthews, we've got a situation. Bethany Wallace, 56, collapsed at home. Critical condition. She's in surgery now, but there have been complications." Elijah's mind clicked into place like a well-oiled machine. There was no time for hesitation. "Prep me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. There was no room for doubt when lives were at stake. As Elijah suited up for surgery, the gravity of the situation settled over him. Bethany Wallace had been rushed in earlier after collapsing at home. What was supposed to be a routine procedure had turned into something far more dangerous. Elijah knew the stakes. They were always high in this line of work. But he was ready. Inside the operating room, the air was thick with tension. The team had been working for hours, and the strain was starting to show. Elijah, however, remained steady. His hands moved with surgical precision, blocking out everything but the task at hand. Every motion was deliberate, every decision calculated. This was where he thrived, in the delicate balance between life and death. Bethany's condition had been more fragile than anticipated. What was supposed to be a straightforward surgery had quickly escalated into a fight for survival. A blood vessel had ruptured, and the team was struggling to control the bleeding. The monitors beeped urgently, warning of her dropping vitals. The team was starting to sweat, their calm beginning to crack under the weight of the moment. But Elijah didn't waver. His hands remained steady, even as the pressure mounted. He gave instructions in his calm, authoritative voice, guiding his team through the storm. Step by step, they worked to stabilize Bethany, sealing the ruptured vessel and stopping the internal bleeding. It was a slow, painstaking process, but Elijah's focus never broke. The surgery stretched on, the minutes turning into hours, but Elijah pushed through. He could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping into his body, but he pushed it aside. His focus was absolute. His responsibility was clear. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew that hesitation or doubt could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bleeding was under control. The beeping of the monitors began to stabilize, and the room, once filled with tension, started to relax. The worst was over. Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When he finally stepped back from the operating table, the room was silent, save for the steady hum of machines. Bethany Wallace was stable, her vitals were holding, and the worst was over. Elijah peeled off his gloves, his mind already shifting to the next task. There was no time for applause, no moment of triumph. This was his job, saving lives, one after another. He didn't need recognition. What mattered was that Bethany would live. That was his reward. As he exited the operating room, the familiar exhaustion settled over him. Hours had passed, and the hospital was still buzzing with the never-ending stream of emergencies. But before he could move on to the next case, his pager buzzed. It was Bethany Wallace. She had woken up. Elijah made his way to the recovery room, mentally preparing for the standard post-op conversation. He had done this 100 times before, reassuring patients, explaining procedures, giving them hope for recovery. But as he stepped into Bethany's room, he immediately sensed something different. Bethany's face was tight with pain, her features scrunched in a grimace. But as her eyes opened and landed on Elijah, the pain turned into something else, something far more hostile. "You!" she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "Get me the real doctor. I don't want you near me." Elijah froze, momentarily taken aback by the sheer hatred in her voice. He had been here before, but it never failed to sting. Years of medical training, years of experience, And still, this was all she saw. For a brief moment, the room seemed to shrink. The air thickened with tension as Bethany's gaze bore into him, filled with a hatred that transcended reason. Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. This wasn't about the surgery, about the life he had saved. This was about something deeper, uglier. "I performed your surgery, Miss Wallace," he said, his tone neutral, professional. "Your condition was critical, but you pulled through. You're stable now, and you're on the path to recovery." But Bethany wasn't listening. Her eyes narrowed as she glared at him. "You call this pulling through?" she sneered, pointing to the bandages on her abdomen. "I've never felt worse in my life. What did you do to me?" Her words dripped with contempt, and Elijah felt the familiar frustration rise in his chest. It didn't matter that he had saved her life. It didn't matter that he had spent hours in that operating room fighting to keep her alive. All that mattered to her was what she saw, the black man standing at her bedside. He had encountered patients like Bethany before, but it never got easier. It didn't matter how many lives he saved, how much he had proven himself in the field. For people like Bethany, all that mattered was the color of his skin. "I understand you're in pain," Elijah replied, keeping his voice even. "That's normal after surgery, but your vitals are stable and you're healing as expected. You'll need time to recover, but you're on the right track." Bethany's lips curled into a sneer. "I don't want to hear that from you," she snapped. "I want someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who's qualified." Elijah stood at the foot of her bed, his face unreadable. He had faced this kind of hostility before, the kind that didn't care about facts or expertise, the kind that only saw skin color. Bethany Wallace didn't see him as a doctor. She saw him as a black man, and that was all she needed to condemn him. "No, I assure you, Miss Wallace, you're receiving the best care available," Elijah said quietly. "But if you'd like a second opinion, I can arrange it." Bethany huffed, turning her face away from him in disgust. "Get me someone else," she muttered. "I don't trust you." Elijah didn't respond. He simply nodded once, his expression calm, and left the room. But as he walked down the hallway, the weight of the encounter pressed heavily on his chest. He had done everything right, everything by the book. He had saved her life. But to Bethany Wallace, none of that mattered. It wasn't the first time Elijah had encountered a patient like Bethany. It wouldn't be the last. But it didn't make it any easier. In the staff room, Elijah leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a brief moment of peace. The noise of the hospital hummed around him, steady and familiar, grounding him. But in the back of his mind, Bethany's words echoed, sharp and stinging. "Get me the real doctor." He opened his eyes, staring at the blank wall in front of him. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the reality they represented. No matter how many lives he saved, no matter how many hours he worked, people like Bethany would always see him as less than. It didn't matter that he had graduated at the top of his class, that he had years of experience, that he had just saved her life. In her eyes, he wasn't worthy, and that reality weighed heavier than anything else. Elijah tried to shake it off, but he knew deep down it would never be that simple. The lingering sting of Bethany's hatred would stay with him, not just for the rest of the day, but for the rest of his life. It was a reminder of the world he lived in, a world where even saving someone's life wasn't enough to escape the venom of racism. But for now, there was another patient waiting, another life to save. And Elijah, like always, would carry on. Elijah stood in the hallway outside Bethany Wallace's room, his back against the wall. The encounter had been brief, but the weight of it lingered. The bitterness in her voice, the sharpness of her words. It wasn't new to him, but it never stopped stinging. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the frustration. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last, but that didn't make it easier. He had learned long ago how to keep his emotions in check, how to stay calm and professional in the face of hostility. But some days like this, it was hard. Taking a deep breath, he pushed himself off the wall and started walking toward the nurse's station. He needed to check on his other patients to keep moving forward, but even as he walked away, Bethany's words echoed in his mind. "Get me the real doctor," as if he hadn't just saved her life. The hospital buzzed with the usual hum of activity, nurses moving between rooms, doctors consulting with one another, patients being wheeled through the hallways. But for Elijah, the noise felt distant, like it was happening in a different world. His mind was still with Bethany, still replaying the encounter in his head. How many times had he been in this situation? How many times had a patient looked at him and seen only his skin color, disregarding the years of training, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices he had made to get to where he was? It was exhausting carrying that weight, knowing that no matter how skilled he was, no matter how many lives he saved, there would always be people like Bethany who would never see past the surface. He reached the nurse's station and grabbed the chart for his next patient. As he scanned through the notes, a nurse approached him, her face pinched with concern. "Dr. Matthews," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "Miss Wallace is still asking for you. She's not happy." Elijah sighed, setting down the chart. Of course she was still angry. Of course she wasn't going to let this go. "I'll check on her later," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "But if she wants to see another doctor, I'll arrange it." The nurse hesitated, biting her lip. "She's been saying some things about you." Elijah raised an eyebrow, but he wasn't surprised. He had been through this before. Patients like Bethany often thought they could use their prejudice as a weapon, wielding it to get their way. It didn't matter if their accusations had no basis in reality. All that mattered was that they believed they were right. "What kind of things?" he asked, though he already had a good idea. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "She's been talking to some of the other nurses, saying she doesn't trust you, that you might have done something wrong in the surgery." There it was, the beginning of the accusations. It always started this way, whispers of doubt, baseless claims that slowly grew into something more dangerous. Elijah had seen it happen before, and he knew how quickly it could spiral out of control. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. "Thanks for letting me know." The nurse nodded, relief flickering across her face as she turned to leave. Elijah watched her go, his mind already racing with what he would say to Bethany. He had been through this before, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. As he walked down the hallway toward his next patient, he couldn't help but think about how unfair it all was. He had spent years building his reputation, earning the respect of his colleagues and his patients. And yet one person who refused to see him as anything more than his skin color, could try to tear all of that down with a few words. Elijah shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He had other patients to care for, other lives to save. He couldn't let Bethany's hatred derail him. But deep down, the frustration simmered. A few hours later, Elijah found himself standing outside Bethany's room once again. He had spent the morning checking on his other patients, performing rounds, doing everything he could to keep his mind off the confrontation that awaited him. But now, there was no avoiding it. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Bethany was sitting up in bed, her arms crossed over her chest, her face twisted into a scowl. The moment she saw Elijah, her expression hardened even further. "Oh, it's you again," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I thought I made it clear I didn't want you anywhere near me." Elijah approached the foot of her bed, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm your assigned doctor, Miss Wallace. I'm here to check on your recovery." "I don't care what you're here for," she snapped. "I want someone else, someone who actually knows what they're doing." Elijah glanced at her chart, noting that her vitals were stable. Physically, she was healing well, but the hostility in her voice made it clear that she wasn't going to make this easy. "Your recovery is going as expected," he said calmly. "There's no need for concern. If you're in pain, I can adjust your medication." Bethany scoffed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "Pain? You think that's what this is about? I don't trust you. How do I know you didn't do something to me during the surgery?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly what he had been expecting. The accusations had begun. "I assure you," he said evenly, "your surgery was performed according to the highest standards. There were no complications. You're recovering well." Bethany sneered. "That's what you say." But I know people like you. You think you can just come in here and do whatever you want and no one will notice. Well, I noticed. I can feel it. Something's not right. Elijah stood still, letting her words wash over him. He had heard it all before. The insinuations, the baseless accusations, the thinly veiled racism hiding behind a veneer of concern. It didn't matter that he had done everything right. In Bethany's eyes, his competence was irrelevant. "If you'd like a second opinion," he said quietly, "I can arrange for another doctor to examine you. But I can assure you, everything is progressing as it should." Bethany's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't need another doctor. I need someone who knows what they're doing. Not someone like you." Elijah didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. But that didn't make it any easier. "You're receiving the best care possible," he said calmly. "If there's anything you need, please let the nurses know." "I don't need anything from you," she snapped. "I'll have you fired for this, you know. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did." Elijah felt a familiar pang of frustration in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had faced this kind of hostility before, and he knew that responding with anger would only give her more fuel. "I'll inform the hospital director of your request to see another doctor," he said quietly. "In the meantime, please rest. I'll check on you later." With that, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. But even as he walked away, Bethany's words lingered in the air, sharp and venomous. Back in the staff room, Elijah sat down at the table, his head in his hands. The confrontation had gone exactly as he had expected, but that didn't make it any less draining. Bethany's accusations, her blatant racism, it weighed on him more than he liked to admit. He had dealt with patients like Bethany before, patients who couldn't see past his skin color, who refused to accept that a black man could be their doctor. But it never stopped hurting. No matter how many times it happened, it never stopped feeling like a punch to the gut. And now the accusations had started. Bethany wasn't just angry. She was looking for a way to tear him down, to attack his career. And in the world they lived in, that was a dangerous game. Even baseless accusations could create waves, could damage his reputation, his career. Elijah rubbed his temples, trying to push the thoughts away. He had other patients to care for, other lives to save. He couldn't let this consume him, but the weight of it all was heavy. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Dr. Karen Holloway, the hospital's director, standing in the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern. "I heard what happened with Miss Wallace," she said, stepping into the room. Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." Dr. Holloway gave him a sympathetic look. "I know, but that doesn't make it right." She sat down across from him, her expression serious. "She's already started making noise, complaints, threats of lawsuits." Elijah nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much." Dr. Holloway rubbed her temples, clearly frustrated. "It's all baseless, of course, but we both know how these things can go. Even unfounded accusations can cause trouble." Elijah remained quiet, the weight of her words settling over him. He knew exactly what she meant. It didn't matter if the accusations were baseless. It didn't matter if he had done everything right. The damage could still be done. "You've done everything right," Dr. Holloway said firmly. "We'll handle this, but I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Elijah gave her a small, tired smile. "I'm fine, just tired." Dr. Holloway nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We'll get through this. You've got the hospital's full support." Elijah appreciated her words, but deep down he knew that this battle was far from over. Bethany Wallace wasn't going to let this go easily, and neither, it seemed, was he. Elijah Matthews sat in the quiet staff room, the weight of the past few days hanging over him like a dark cloud. The frustration was thick in his chest, and despite his best efforts to shake it off, Bethany Wallace's accusations lingered in his mind. He had faced racism before, but this was different. This time, her words had the power to destroy everything he had worked for. The door creaked open, and Greg Sanders, the head of hospital security, stepped inside. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his expression was tight with concern. Elijah, Greg began, his voice low. We've got a problem. Elijah looked up from his hands, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He knew exactly what Greg was going to say before he said it. It's Miss Wallace, isn't it? Elijah asked, his tone resigned. Greg nodded, walking further into the room. She's not letting up. She's been talking to anyone who will listen. Other patients, nurses, even visitors. And now she's talking about filing a formal complaint. Elijah exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. I knew this was coming. Greg leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. She's accusing you of medical negligence. Says you deliberately botched her surgery because you don't like her. That you're trying to make her recovery worse. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He had done everything by the book. There was nothing wrong with the surgery. Bethany Wallace's recovery was progressing exactly as expected. And yet here she was, spinning a narrative designed to tear him down. Has she actually filed the complaint yet? Elijah asked, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. Greg shook his head. Not yet, but she's threatening to. She's saying she's going to go to the hospital board, and if they don't listen, she'll take it to the media. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over him. He had been here before, faced with the threat of false accusations, with the knowledge that a single complaint could unravel everything he had built. But this felt different. This felt bigger. Is Dr. Holloway aware? Elijah asked, opening his eyes again. Yeah, she's been talking to legal, Greg said, his tone serious. She knows you're in the clear, but you know how these things can go. Even if the accusations are baseless, it could still turn into a mess. Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's words. He had seen it happen before, how a single accusation, no matter how unfounded, could damage a doctor's reputation, cast doubt over their abilities, and make their career a battlefield. He had worked too hard to let this happen, but he also knew that some fights were inevitable. Thanks for letting me know, Elijah said quietly, standing up from the table. Greg gave him a sympathetic nod. Hang in there, man, you've got people on your side. Elijah appreciated Greg's words, but deep down he knew that the fight wasn't over. Bethany Wallace wasn't just angry, she was on a mission and she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. And what she wanted was to see him fall. Later that evening, Elijah found himself sitting across from Dr. Karen Holloway in her office. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of the conversation ahead hung heavily in the air. Dr. Holloway's desk was cluttered with papers and files, but her attention was focused entirely on Elijah. I've spoken to the legal team, Dr. Holloway began, her voice measured. They're aware of the situation, and they're ready to support you if this escalates. But you should know, Miss Wallace isn't backing down. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. I figured as much. Dr. Holloway sighed, rubbing her temples. She's threatening to sue, Elijah. She claims you deliberately harmed her during the surgery because of her race. Elijah felt a flash of anger flare up inside him, but he kept his expression neutral. That's ridiculous. I did everything by the book. Her recovery is going as expected. I know that, and the legal team knows that, Dr. Holloway said firmly. But if this goes public, it's going to be messy. Even if the case is baseless, the media can twist it into something bigger. Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always known that being a black doctor in a predominantly white institution came with challenges. But this was something else entirely. Bethany Wallace wasn't just trying to discredit him, she was trying to ruin him. What do you suggest I do? Elijah asked, his voice steady but weary. Dr. Holloway met his gaze, her expression serious. Keep doing your job. Keep being the professional you've always been. We have your back, Elijah. The hospital stands behind you, but you need to be prepared for a fight. Elijah appreciated her support, but the thought of what was coming filled him with a sense of dread. He had spent his entire career fighting to prove himself, to earn his place in a world that wasn't always welcoming, and now it felt like all of that was at risk. I'll do what I need to do, Elijah said quietly, his resolve hardening. I'm not going to let her tear me down. Dr. Holloway nodded, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Good, because you're not alone in this. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Bethany Wallace continued to spread her accusations, and the rumor mill within the hospital began to churn. Nurses whispered in the hallways, and even some of Elijah's colleagues gave him sympathetic looks as they passed by. It wasn't long before the hospital board got involved. A formal review was launched, and Elijah found himself sitting in front of a panel of administrators, explaining every detail of Bethany's surgery and recovery. He had gone over the case 100 times in his mind, and he knew there was nothing he could have done differently. But that didn't make the process any less nerve-wracking. As he sat in the sterile conference room, the administrators asked question after question, their faces unreadable. Elijah answered calmly and confidently, providing all the necessary documentation to support his case. But the tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Matthews, one of the administrators, finally said, his voice formal. "We understand that this is a difficult situation, but we need to ensure that every protocol was followed during Miss Wallace's surgery. Are you absolutely certain that there were no deviations from standard procedure?" Elijah met the man's gaze, his tone unwavering. "I followed every protocol to the letter. There were no complications during the surgery, and Miss Wallace's recovery is progressing as expected." The administrator nodded, jotting down notes. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews. We'll be in touch once we've completed our review." Elijah left the room with his head held high, but the knot of anxiety in his stomach remained. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he also knew how easily things could spiral out of control. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The hospital review had gone as well as it could have, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. Bethany Wallace was determined to ruin him, and despite his confidence in his abilities, the fear of what could happen lingered in the back of his mind. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Dr. Holloway. "Keep your head up, we're with you." Elijah appreciated the sentiment, but the reality of the situation felt heavier than ever. He had always known that being a black doctor came with challenges, but this was something he hadn't been prepared for. The fight for his reputation, for his career, was just beginning. The following week, things took a turn for the worse. Bethany Wallace had filed her formal complaint, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. Headlines began to circulate, painting Elijah as the villain, accusing him of negligence and worse. The articles were filled with inflammatory language, designed to stir up outrage and sell papers. Black doctor accused of deliberately harming white patient. Racism in the operating room? Patient claims doctor tried to sabotage surgery. Elijah couldn't believe what he was reading. The truth had been twisted beyond recognition, and now the court of public opinion was weighing in. He received phone calls from reporters, emails from news outlets asking for his side of the story. But no matter how much he tried to explain the truth, it felt like his words were falling on deaf ears. The narrative had already been spun, and now it was out of his control. As he walked through the hospital, he could feel the eyes on him, patients, nurses, even some of his colleagues. The whispers followed him wherever he went, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had been here before, but never like this. This time, it felt like the world was closing in on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elijah sat in his office, staring at the patient files in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been days since the media storm began, and the hospital halls no longer felt like a place of healing. Everywhere he went, he could feel the stares, hear the whispers. It was like walking through a minefield, never knowing when something would explode. The media had taken Bethany Wallace's accusations and run with them, crafting stories that played on racial tensions and painted Elijah as a villain. Even though the hospital had issued a statement supporting him, it hadn't been enough to stop the tidal wave of public opinion. The headlines were everywhere, each one worse than the last. He had done everything right. He had followed every protocol, provided the best care possible, and yet, here he was, on the verge of losing everything because of one patient's refusal to accept him as her doctor. It felt surreal, like he was living in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Greg Sanders, the head of security. Elijah, we need to talk. She's back, in the lobby. Elijah's heart sank. He knew exactly who Greg was talking about. Bethany Wallace. She had been discharged from the hospital days ago, but apparently that hadn't been the end of it. Now she was back, and judging by Greg's message, she wasn't here to make amends. Taking a deep breath, Elijah stood up and headed for the lobby. He had faced Bethany's hostility before, but this time, it felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. The media attention, the rumors, the hospital's internal review, it all felt like it was building towards something, and he wasn't sure what would happen next. As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the tension in the air. Nurses avoided his gaze, and even the patients seemed to be watching him more closely. It was like the whole hospital had become a stage, and he was the main character in a drama he never wanted to be part of. When he reached the lobby, he saw her immediately. Bethany Wallace stood near the reception desk, her face set in a familiar scowl. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was a younger man in a suit, his posture stiff and professional. Elijah recognized the type instantly, her lawyer. Greg stood nearby, his arms crossed and his expression grim. As soon as he saw Elijah, he gave a slight nod, signaling that it was time. Elijah took a deep breath and walked over, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dr. Matthews," Bethany said, her voice sharp and cold. "We meet again." Elijah kept his expression neutral. "Miss Wallace, I understand you have some concerns, but I assure you, your surgery went according to standard procedures. You're healing well." Bethany's eyes narrowed. "That's not what this is about, and you know it." She gestured to the man beside her. "This is my lawyer, Mr. Deacon. We're here because we've decided to move forward with legal action." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his composure. "Legal action?" Mr. Deacon stepped forward, his tone measured and professional. "Miss Wallace is filing a lawsuit against you, Dr. Matthews, and the hospital. She believes you intentionally caused her harm during her surgery and will be pursuing damages for medical negligence and racial discrimination." For a moment, Elijah couldn't speak. He had known this was coming, had seen the signs, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way that nothing else had. The accusations were false, and he knew it. But the power of a lawsuit wasn't about truth. It was about perception. And right now, perception was working against him. "I see," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'll make sure the hospital's legal team is aware. We'll handle this through the proper channels." Bethany smirked, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you will. But just know this, you won't get away with what you've done. I'll make sure of it." Elijah didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would change her mind. She had already decided that he was guilty, and now she was determined to destroy him. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Wallace," Elijah said quietly. "But I assure you, I did everything in my power to ensure your health and recovery." Bethany's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. "Don't talk to me like I'm some charity case. You people always think you can get away with anything, but not this time." Elijah felt the weight of her words settle on his chest, heavy and suffocating. "I understand you're upset," he replied calmly, "but please let the legal teams handle this." Without another word, Elijah turned and walked away, his mind spinning. This was it. The lawsuit was happening. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for. It was all on the line. That evening, Elijah sat in his apartment, the silence around him deafening. He had spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of his job but barely processing anything. The confrontation with Bethany had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and now that he was alone, the weight of it all was crashing down on him. He thought back to the early days of his career when he had been so full of hope and determination. He had known that being a black doctor would come with challenges, but he had believed that his skill and dedication would be enough to overcome them, and for the most part, they had been. He had earned the respect of his colleagues, his patients, and his community. But now, all of that felt fragile, like it could be taken away in an instant. The lawsuit wasn't just an attack on his abilities as a doctor, it was an attack on his very identity. Bethany Wallace didn't see him as a person, as a professional. She saw him as a target, a symbol of everything she hated. And now she was trying to destroy him, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Dr. Holloway. "Meeting with legal tomorrow. Stay strong." Elijah appreciated the support, but the message did little to ease the anxiety twisting in his gut. He knew the hospital's legal team was good, but lawsuits were messy, unpredictable, and the court of public opinion was already working against him. He had done nothing wrong, but in a world where perception was everything, the truth didn't always matter. The next day, Elijah sat in a conference room with the hospital's legal team. Dr. Holloway was there too, her expression serious but supportive. The lead attorney, a sharp woman named Amanda, laid out the situation. "Miss Wallace has filed her lawsuit," Amanda began, her tone brisk. "She's claiming medical negligence and racial discrimination. From what we've seen so far, her case is weak. There's no evidence to support her claims, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that this could escalate." Elijah nodded, trying to absorb everything she was saying. It felt surreal, like he was watching the whole thing unfold from a distance. "We'll be conducting our own internal investigation," Amanda continued. "But I want you to know that we believe in your abilities, Dr. Matthews. We have no reason to doubt your professionalism, and the hospital is fully behind you." Elijah appreciated her words, but the pit in his stomach remained. He had seen how lawsuits like this could spiral out of control, how even baseless accusations could ruin careers. And with the media already involved, it felt like the situation was slipping further and further out of his hands. "What's our next step?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but tense. "We'll be filing a motion to dismiss," Amanda replied, "but that could take time. And in the meantime, we need to be prepared for the possibility that this will go to trial." Elijah nodded again, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't going to be over anytime soon. The fight was just beginning. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Elijah's career. The lawsuit hung over him like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over everything he did. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his work, on his patients, the weight of the accusations was always there, pressing down on him. The media coverage only made things worse. Every day, new articles appeared, each one more sensationalized than the last. Even though the hospital had issued multiple statements in support of him, the damage had been done. In the eyes of the public, he was already guilty, and then the threat started. Anonymous messages, phone calls, emails, people accusing him of being a monster, of hurting his patients, of being a racist himself. It didn't matter that none of it was true. The more the media fanned the flames, the worse it got. Elijah tried to block it out, tried to focus on his patients, but it was impossible to ignore. The hate, the anger, it was everywhere. And no matter how much support he had from the hospital, from his friends, from his family, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle for his reputation, for his life. And no matter how hard he fought, it felt like the world was against him. The courtroom was cold and clinical, a far cry from the chaotic energy of the hospital where Elijah Matthews spent most of his time. But today, it wasn't the steady hum of medical equipment or the hurried footsteps of nurses that filled his ears. It was the low murmur of the gallery, the sound of pens scratching against paper, and the occasional shuffle of legal documents. Elijah sat beside the hospital's legal team, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Bethany Wallace sat with her lawyer, Mr. Deacon, her face twisted in righteous indignation. The room buzzed with tension, reporters seated in the back rows ready to turn every moment into a headline. It had been months since Bethany first filed her lawsuit, and every day since had been a battle. The media frenzy had only grown worse, with each new article framing Elijah as a negligent doctor, a villain. His reputation had taken a hit, and even though his colleagues had stood by him, he couldn't escape the whispers that followed him through the hospital halls. Now it all came down to this, the courtroom, the final battle. The judge entered, and the room fell into a hush. The trial was about to begin. As the trial unfolded, Elijah listened as the lawyers laid out their cases. Bethany's lawyer, Mr. Deacon, painted a vivid picture of a vulnerable woman, placed under the care of a doctor who supposedly harbored racial bias and intentionally botched her surgery. It was a carefully crafted narrative, one that played into the racial tensions that had been stoked by the media. Elijah sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, as the lawyer described him as a reckless, dangerous doctor who had no regard for Bethany's well-being. The accusations were baseless, but they were delivered with a kind of confidence that made Elijah's stomach churn. "And what's worse," Mr. Deacon said, his voice rising for dramatic effect, "is that this man, this doctor, showed no remorse. Miss Wallace trusted him with her life, and he violated that trust." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He had been warned not to react, not to let the lawyer's words get under his skin. But it wasn't easy. Every word felt like a blow, each accusation like a weight pressing down on his chest. When it was finally the defense's turn, the hospital's lead attorney, Amanda, stood up. She was composed and calm, her voice steady as she began to dismantle the case piece by piece. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Amanda began, "what you've heard today is a story, a carefully constructed narrative designed to prey on fears and prejudices. But the truth is far simpler. Dr. Matthews is an experienced, highly skilled surgeon who followed every protocol during Miss Wallace's surgery. Her recovery was typical for the procedure, and there is no evidence to suggest that Dr. Matthews acted with anything but the utmost professionalism." Amanda went on to present evidence, medical records, testimony from nurses and other doctors, and documentation of Elijah's impeccable record. The facts were clear. There had been no negligence, no wrongdoing. But even as the evidence was laid out, Elijah couldn't help but feel the weight of the jury's eyes on him, judging him not just for his actions, but for who he was. The trial dragged on for days. Witnesses were called, experts testified, and both sides argued their cases with fervor. Elijah sat through it all, feeling like a spectator in his own life. He had always prided himself on being able to control the outcomes in the operating room, but here, in this courtroom, everything felt out of his hands. On the fourth day, it was finally Elijah's turn to take the stand. He walked to the witness stand, feeling the eyes of the entire room on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm, his posture steady. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt overwhelming. Amanda approached him with a reassuring smile, standing beside him as the questioning began. "Dr. Matthews," Amanda said, her voice clear and confident, "can you walk us through the events of Miss Wallace's surgery, from the moment she was admitted to the hospital to the moment she was discharged?" Elijah nodded and began recounting the events. He spoke calmly, detailing each step of the procedure, the decisions he had made, and the precautions he had taken. As he spoke, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were talking about someone else's life, someone else's experience. "And during this surgery," Amanda asked, "did you deviate from any standard medical procedures?" "No," Elijah replied firmly. "I followed every protocol as I do with every surgery." "And did Miss Wallace's recovery proceed as expected?" "Yes, her recovery was typical for the procedure. There were no complications." Amanda nodded, then stepped back. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews. No further questions." Elijah exhaled slowly, grateful for the moment of reprieve. But it didn't last long. Mr. Deacon stood up, straightening his tie as he prepared to cross-examine. "Dr. Matthews," Mr. Deacon began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you claim that you followed every protocol, that Miss Wallace's recovery was typical. But isn't it true that she complained of severe pain after the surgery? Pain that you dismissed?" Elijah kept his voice steady. "Miss Wallace did express discomfort, but post-surgical pain is common. I adjusted her medication accordingly." "But you didn't take her concerns seriously, did you?" Mr. Deacon pressed. "You assumed she was overreacting, isn't that right?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "I took her concerns seriously. I monitored her recovery closely." Mr. Deacon raised an eyebrow, turning to the jury as if to let his words sink in. "Or maybe, Dr. Matthews, you didn't care about her concerns because you had already decided that her pain wasn't worth your time." Elijah's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "That's not true." Mr. Deacon circled the courtroom, pacing as he spoke. You see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a doctor who thinks he's above it all, who thinks he can dismiss the concerns of his patients because he's the one in control. He turned back to Elijah, his eyes cold. Tell me, Dr. Matthews, do you believe that race played a role in how you treated Miss Wallace? Elijah's stomach turned at the question, but he didn't flinch. Absolutely not. I treat every patient with the same level of care and professionalism. But Miss Wallace seems to think otherwise, Mr. Deacon said, his voice sharp. And we all know that perception is reality. Isn't that right? Elijah didn't respond. He knew that no matter how many facts were on his side, this trial wasn't just about the truth. It was about perception, about how people saw him, and how Bethany Wallace had weaponized that perception against him. Nothing further, Mr. Deacon said, returning to his seat. The trial continued, and as each day passed, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. Elijah felt like he was walking a tightrope. Every word he spoke scrutinized, every move he made dissected. But through it all, he held on to the one thing he knew: he had done nothing wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day of closing arguments arrived. Amanda stood before the jury, her voice steady and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence. You've seen the medical records, the testimony of witnesses, the facts. Dr. Matthews is a highly respected surgeon who provided the best care possible for Miss Wallace. There was no negligence, no malice, no racial bias. The only thing that matters here is the truth. And the truth is that Dr. Matthews did his job. When it was Mr. Deacon's turn, he played to the emotions of the jury, painting a picture of a woman betrayed by a doctor she had trusted. He didn't need facts. He had already won over the media, and now he was trying to win over the jury with the same strategy, appealing to their fears, their biases. As the jury deliberated, Elijah sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, his hands clasped together. Dr. Holloway sat beside him, her expression calm but concerned. You did everything you could, she said softly. Elijah nodded, but the knot in his stomach didn't ease. He had done everything right, but that didn't mean the jury would see it that way. He knew how these things worked. It wasn't always about the truth. Sometimes it was about who could tell the most compelling story. After what felt like hours, the jury returned. Elijah stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest as the foreman read the verdict. On the charge of medical negligence, we find the defendant, Dr. Elijah Matthews, not guilty. Elijah exhaled, relief flooding his body. On the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant, Dr. Elijah Matthews, not guilty. The room was silent for a moment, and then the tension broke. The trial was over. That evening, Elijah stood outside the hospital, looking out at the city skyline. The weight of the past months still lingered, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. He had won the trial, but the fight had taken its toll. The scars from the ordeal would stay with him, a reminder of how easily everything he had worked for could have been taken away. But as he stood there, he knew that he had come out stronger. He had faced the worst, and he had survived. And now it was time to move forward.